Glenn, how are you?
Hey there, Josh. I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. A little tired today, but, comes with the territory. Something like
it's
that.
a hard job, isn't it?
Yeah, right. Right. I forgot. Yes, it is.
Some people have real jobs.
Right. So you had a big week. I guess it was last week. You went down to Washington to talk to the Joint Economic Committee about the issues about imprisonment and race and imprisonment that you'd written about in your Boston Review article.
Yeah.
How was that?
Well, it was an interesting experience. I have testified before Congress before, but it's been a few years, and there was Senator Jim Webb chairing this session. Chuck Schumer would have been there, but had a conflict. He's chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, and he gave the hearings his blessing. It was really Webb's initiative, though, to have hearings on the topic of mass incarceration and the cost to our society. And Senator Sam Brownback was present, made an opening statement, and stayed for almost the entirety of the hearings. And Senator Bob Casey was also there, along with some members of Congress. Persons. And it was a lively discussion. I was not the only witness, of course.
Right.
Bruce
Western was there.
From Harvard was there, and there was a guy named Pat Nolan from the Prison Fellowship Ministries, who had been a Republican state assemblyman in California, and served 18 months, I believe, in federal prison, caught in a FBI sting operation on some campaign finance stuff.
I see.
And was there, using his personal experience and also his Christian commitment and involvement with Prison Fellowship to...
This is the Chuck Colson organization,
the Chuck
Prison
Colson
Fellowship.
organization.
And you had some connection with that organization, I think you mentioned.
I served on their board of directors for a number of years in the 90s. And there was a fellow named Jacobson who runs the Vera Institute for Justice, who is a former professor of criminal justice at City College and had a big administrative position in New York City, helping to run Rikers Island and such in the 90s.
So was there any convergence of opinion among different people? Anything interesting that emerged from this that unexpected?
Everybody, all the opening statements from the members of Congress remarked on how massive the scale of incarceration is, and at least suggested that it was worrisome. There were different, sort of toned in the statements, but they all expressed a worry about this, as whether this wasn't something bad for our society. And there was also, I thought, a consensus that more needed to be done to assist in the transition of ex-offenders out of prison and back into society. And there was broad support on this panel of congressmen and women of the so-called Second Chance Act, which I gather has fared better in the Senate than it has in the House, and which appropriates some monies to assist the states in programs to transition, people from prison back into ordinary life. So there was that. But, people were still a little bit cautious. When I talked about the war on drugs, for example,
right.
Nobody wanted to come near that with a 10-foot pole.
Nobody on the panel. No.
No, on the panel. On the congressional panel. No one wanted to say, hey, I think we need to rethink it, or maybe we've stepped over the line, or whatever. Right. There was kind of a no comment on that.
So there was a sense that the outcome is regrettable, but no real perspective other than these transitions back to civilian life, so to speak. No real perspective on how you might go and do something about. Not that that's an easy problem. I don't mean to be making light of it, but no real perspective on what.
Yeah, there was that sense, I think, and across the board. I mean, Senator Brownback, who's running for president, made a big deal out of the fact that he had spent a night or two in jail. He wanted to stress not as an inmate, but as a visitor. Yeah. But nevertheless, the sort of theme of his remarks were, these are human beings, and we can't lose sight of their humanity, with which, of course, I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah. And, I think it's a very helpful sentiment in all of this.
I think it is. I agree with you about that. I've heard him speak to that, and I think it really is arguably the most important point of departure. I think arguments about costs to the society, I just don't think that those arguments really persuade unless you start from the more fundamental moral idea that there's something amiss when you've got 2.3 million people, fellow passengers to the grave, who are imprisoned, and that these are human beings and they did bad stuff. In some cases, hideously bad stuff.
Right. But
that basic perspective that that kind of imprisonment is not something to be celebrated. We got a lot of bad guys. They're getting what they deserve. If you start with the perspective that there's something amiss here because these are people and they've got lives and they're families and they've got lives, and maybe that's really the important point of departure rather than the issue about costs to the society. I don't know if you know the answer to this. I certainly don't. When was the last time, or has there ever been a hearing of this kind before on mass incarceration and its...
Yeah, I don't know. It wouldn't be hard to find out.
Yeah.
Searching, the congressional record, but it's hard for me to imagine there hasn't been. There certainly should have been, but I can't. I can't cite chapter and verse. I just want to mention one other thing, which is the racial disparity of incarceration was also emphasized both by we testifying experts and also the panel of members of Congress. And Bob Casey of Pennsylvania asked, I thought, a pretty interesting question. He says, I see what you're saying. But here, let me play devil's advocate for a minute and kind of, the guy on the street question is, well, if people offended, even if it breaks down really disproportionately by race, that may be very regrettable, but what precisely did you want us to do? Overlook the fact that they had offended? And I thought that was fair enough. And unfortunately, I don't think time permitted, an extensive exploration of that. That's certainly right at the first cut. People have offended. I want to go on to say, however, that when we see such a huge rate of participation from a marginalized community, and when we look at the sort of social structure that sits behind that, I'm talking about massive ghettos in the cities and so on, failed school systems and so on. Then while the sort of first order point is they have offended, that can't be the end of the discussion. And it's like, Lonnie Guinier has this metaphor, the miner's canary. Yeah. She says, the miners take the canary down. If the canary falls over in the mine, they know there's
something bad
in the air.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And likewise, this is an indication of deeper flaws in our society. True enough, individuals have offended and they must be dealt with. But isn't it telling us something more about problems in society when we see such a massive impact of the punishment falling in particular pockets of disadvantage within the society? And so,
I guess the issue there is, we talked about this when we discussed this issue a few times back. You're sitting there, you're on the jury, and you're trying to decide. And I think what you think, and I guess I agree with this, is that when you're sitting there on the jury, these considerations about whether there's a kind of social injustice that lies behind the phenomenon of mass incarceration, and it's a an Hispanic kid or a black kid that's on trial, you just can't take that into consideration in trying to decide whether whether the case has been made beyond a reasonable doubt, and if it's been made beyond a reasonable doubt, do you vote to convict? The issue has to come up. These issues have to be dealt with someplace else, and either by trying to remedy these problems of trying to deal with problems of concentrated inner city poverty, and or on the criminal justice side, dealing with the drug side of this issue, because my understanding is that if you're trying to understand why that incarceration is a kind of, Black and Latino phenomenon, that a big part of the incarceration, the excessive incarceration, so to speak, is for drug crime. So you could partly deal with the problem of incarceration by some kind of decriminalization on the drug side. But I guess that's
a tough one politically, evidently, and it's going to be a while. I think
you don't see any political movement on that. There was no indication of that when you were testifying from anything.
Well, this was 1.5 hours or something before 8 members of Congress. So I can't say that I have the temper of the Congress.
Nobody was posturing about that. Let me put it that way.
I didn't hear any speeches about how is it the Libertarian candidate for president?
Ron Paul?
Nobody gave that speech.
Nobody gave that speech. No, I'm not. Somehow, I'm not shocked to hear that. But one of the issues that you mentioned, and that really is, Senator Casey raised this, and we talked about this some before, and a bunch of people who would listen to our conversation raised this. Obviously, a very important issue here is what you think about issues of personal responsibility and who's got responsibility for dealing with these issues, and what's the division between personal responsibility and responsibilities of the group, and if it's a group, which group is responsible? The country as a whole? We've had conversations over the years about this with our mutual friend, Reverend Eugene Rivers, and he has a very strong position about group responsibility, that there's a strong responsibility in he has a kind of, Black nationalist view, and it's not a Farrakhan-style Black nationalist view. That's what he calls the nationalism of fools.
Yeah.
But a strong position about there being a special responsibility in the African American community for dealing with these issues. And where your position on this has moved over the years. Where are you on this issue now?
Well, so. Let's take Farrakhan, and let's take the Million Man March of 1995, where Louis Farrakhan issued a call, and a very large number, a million is probably a reasonably accurate estimate of the number of men who were there. African-American men from all over the country converged on one place, and, they listened to a lot of speeches, and there was a lot of good feeling, and it was a kind of communal coming together, and the black community and men were going to take responsibility, and so on.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the tenor of this rhetoric. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood, as I am about to criticize it, to seem not to appreciate the heroism and dedication and sacrifice of people like the Reverend Eugene Rivers in Boston, who have made their life's work to, uplift the level of their community in various ways, either through the church or civic organizations or whatever. I certainly appreciate their labors. But when I think back on that 1995 march, the one thing that sticks in my mind is that 1 million African American men assembled on the site of on the Washington Mall, the site of the 1963 March on Washington. There were 3 or 4 times as many people at Farrakhan's march as there were. And we asked nothing of the United States government. Mm-hmm. We had no political agenda. There was no statute that we hoped to be enacted. We didn't go to the halls of the Congress and lobby the representatives there on behalf of whatever it might be, ratcheting down criminal penalties, increasing the availability of child care and health care, doing something about the schools, raising the earned income tax credit, investing in the neighborhoods in which large numbers of poor African American people live. There was no political agenda. And for me, this disjunction between communal responsibility, which you could argue is a sort of existential imperative for any people embedded in their culture with their particular historical inheritance, to be engaged in strengthening families, in their churches and sites of worship, to be constituting meaning in their lives and so forth. Of course, there's a necessity for that, but there's a disjunction between that on the one hand and politics and policy and the actions of the state on the other hand. And to my mind, if you bring 1 million men to the capital of the country, you got to petition the government. And if you don't petition the government, in some sense, the energy that's been engendered doesn't reach its full potential because black Americans don't enact any taxes. We don't pass any statutes. It's the state. It's the American people. So yes, there's responsibilities for black people in some sense, but the more primary and elemental responsibilities are the public and civic responsibilities of the American people, of whom black Americans are a constituent element. But it's the American people and the public agenda that should be stressed. And I think that point gets lost sometimes in this rush to embrace communal responsibility, since it can only take one so far.
Yeah, but let's pushing on this. Let's say it's agreed that communal responsibility can only take you so far. There's a division of responsibilities, or personal responsibilities, communal responsibilities of different groups, and national responsibility. But the argument can be made. First step here, in order for the government to constructively intervene, when you're not talking about changing voting rights laws, when you're not talking about changing laws that grant access to accommodations, when you're not talking about basically ending a legally enforced system of racial apartheid, the first step is for people in the communities, in the neighborhoods where there are real troubles, in the families, to start to do stuff together. And if people are not prepared to act together, to organize, not just to get together and say kumbaya, whether 1 million guys in Washington or 10,000 of them in Boston or wherever, but to build real organizations that are on the ground, that are taking steps, that are being successful, that are having some successes. Of course, they need to have some support, but if that's not going to be happening, then best policy ideas in the world articulated at the national level aren't going to have the desired effect. So I can agree with you. I'm not sure what I think about this, but we're supposed to be disagreeing more. So we're going to act at least like
I'll argue with you.
Yeah. So
strong communities are a good thing. I mean, no one's disputing that. But let me give another example, come at this a little bit indirectly. Yesterday, I should say Sunday, on Meet the Press, Tim Russert gave over his entire hour to a conversation with Bill Cosby and Alvin Poussaint, who's a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School,
right,
on their new book, which is titled "Come On, People."
Yeah.
Which is a plea to black people, especially poor black people, to take more responsibility in their lives and in their communities for the raising of their children and for the establishment of healthy values and so forth and so on. Now, nobody can be against that,
right?
Sensibly. No one can be against telling young boys to pull their socks up, put their pants up around their waist, pay attention in school, learn how to speak standard English, take care of any children that they might sire, and so on. I don't see how anyone can be against the doing of that.
Right.
And those sermons have been and are being preached in, black churches and communal organizations all across the country, and have been so for many, many decades. But I couldn't get loose from the idea that this was Meet the Press. Mm-hmm. And that last week I had seen the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State and the Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and all of that the audience were the power elite of American society, mm-hmm. and that the topic of discussion was the quality of communal life amongst African Americans. Yeah. Again, I don't want to be misunderstood. It's not as if there aren't problems in communal life among African Americans. It's not some politically correct filter that I'm saying no one can talk about this but black people, or black people ought not to wash their dirty linen. That's not what I'm arguing at all. Yeah. I'm arguing that a terrific opportunity was missed, it seems to me. That if we have the nation's attention, and we're talking about these issues, that we don't engage the nation with respect to the things that we as a people, that is the American people, can do to mitigate these problems. So while I'm not attacking the politics of Cosby and Poussaint, I think they might agree with my list of progressive reforms of one kind or another. I'm talking about the nature of public discourse.
Yes. So they never said at any point in the course of their presentations, of course, this is one piece. You can argue whether it's a big piece or a small piece. This is one piece of a much larger problem, and the rest of you are, not that they put it in these words, but the rest of you who are listening to this need to get your act together and act more in a more collectively responsible way about the gross inequality in the society, the lack of fair social policies. No, they didn't say anything like that.
No, they didn't. I have not read their book yet, and they may say so there. They didn't, and Russell didn't press them on that. Yeah. I mean, what might have been said is, okay, we've given you a laundry list of what Black America needs to do. Now let's talk about what America needs to do, because we're all in this boat together, or something like that. They may think that. They didn't say it. Yeah.
And then I guess what I was thinking also, though, there's a big distance. There's a lot of space in between getting a million guys saying "Kumbaya" and we're going to do our job together in Washington, national policy. So I'm thinking, say, of the work that Gene Rivers did in Boston, which wasn't just preaching sermons, but it was really taking a very hands-on. Some people may say, too many hands-on, too much, but taking a very hands-on attitude toward dealing with the crime issues in Dorchester and Roxbury. And there's an interesting backstory here, which is Gene and a bunch of people who joined with him, they were hanging around Harvard Square.
Yeah.
Gene was a student who was attending courses at Harvard. This was in the mid-1980s.
Yeah,
and my understanding is that they went and they talked to Bob Moses, the guy who, walked through Mississippi doing voter registration.
Yeah.
Bob Moses was then back at Harvard as a philosophy PhD student writing, this was in his algebra project period, writing a dissertation on philosophy of mathematics. And Bob Moses said, you want to talk about building community, rebuilding civil society in inner city neighborhoods, you can't do it by taking the red line over to Dorchester. And so they took his advice. And they moved into one of the, worst areas, most crime-ridden areas of Dorchester in the Four Corners neighborhood. And Gene's house got shot up, as you know, a couple of times.
Yeah, I do know that.
And but it wasn't just making speeches, and it wasn't just delivering sermons, but it also wasn't about national level policy. It was about doing focused organizational work, taking responsibility within the community, also working together with the Boston Police Department. So this was not just a kind of communal responsibility deal. There were a lot of cooperation with the Boston Police Department. And, Senator Kerry and Mayor Menino used to show up at the church Christmas parties. So there was real cooperation, but there was a sense that we got to do something more than talk about this and, give sermons and speeches. There was a real organizational effort. I think...
it's like I said, I don't think anyone can fail to admire that kind of commitment, sacrifice, and discipline and seriousness about dealing with these problems. The story you tell, I was there at Harvard in the early 1980s. I knew Eugene Rivers when the Seymour Society folks were meeting in, one of the dorms around there at Harvard. Right. And, these were young black Christian activists, the intellectuals, and so on. And knew Bob Moses when he was there at Harvard, sitting in that office on Dunster Street in the Afro-American Studies department while he was writing his philosophy dissertation after I don't know how many, 2 decades or 3 of hiatus, and so on. So, I just want to say I'm with those folks. The church that I was very active in when I was more of a Christian than I somehow am today. Was one of a network of churches cooperating together to try to address these problems of violence and so forth. I'm all for it.
Yeah.
And yet I can't help but note that the only reason you have a Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan black ghetto is because of large forces in American society that were bent on maintaining racial segregation.
Yeah.
I mean, you build public housing, you concentrate it on, I'm not talking about Boston now, I'm talking generically about American cities. You get ghettos, they fester, and then we say, yes, we need the heroic and far-sighted evangelical uplift, which may be helpful in the situation, but the situation itself was a product of American economic, political, and social development.
Sitting where I am out here, on the Stanford campus, Palo Alto next door, and there's the way it's done here is what divides Palo Alto from East Palo Alto.
Yeah.
East Palo Alto is poor, black, Hispanic. There's a highway that divides the two. This is really an old-fashioned, you divide race by space deal. But you mentioned in the you were at one time had stronger Christian convictions.
I was a better Christian.
A better Christian. I'm sorry. That's better Christian than you are now.
I don't know that there's any good way to say it.
That's better Christian than you are now. And also, your views on political matters, political philosophical matters generally have changed a lot. I wanted to what was. So you were more, you were a conservative.
I was a conservative. I would have gone to work for Bill Bennett.
Yeah, you were going to go to work for Bill Bennett.
Secretary of Education. I would have gone as his deputy in the Reagan administration in the late 80s, except I had a personal scandal about which anyone who has a search engine can learn as much as they want to know.
Yeah. Well, we don't have to talk about it here unless you want to. But I wonder, what was it like?
Yeah.
We both have academic jobs. We're in universities. There's a lot of complaint. And we can talk about the legitimacy of that complaint in a minute, but there's a lot of complaint about the ideological uniformity of universities, and you were on the other side of the ideological divide, but in two ways. First of all, as you say, you were going to go to work for Bill Bennett. You were a conservative, a black conservative economist in the 1980s, and then also whether you were a better Christian or a less good, you were also there was also a greater sense of religious conviction than probably the people around you. What was your experience? I mean, did you feel marginalized on those ideological and religious grounds?
Well, it was interesting. I was at Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government between 1984 and 1991 during the height of my flaming neoconservatism, and also toward the end of that period when I was a publicly confessing Christian believer, having gone through turmoil in my life and having found Jesus, and I don't say that with any sense of irony, and then having to speak out about it. And you're right, they both were marginalizing positions to have within the academy. I mean, first of all, a lot of black people just hated my guts, because I was using this great opportunity that had been opened up by the sacrifices of our forefathers and foremothers in the civil rights movement, and by the demonstrations of our students to demand more black faculty and more opportunity. And here I was at Harvard with a megaphone up to my mouth, and I was spouting the neoconservative line. So they just thought of me as a traitor. And many liberal whites were very skeptical of me, although I also got a lot of support from some quarters, from quarters of white academics, even at Harvard. These people didn't have to necessarily be conservatives, but they might be a little bit against the grain on one issue or another.
Right.
And they rallied around. So, I didn't miss any meals, if you see what I'm saying. I didn't want for a place to go where I could be treated with respect and so forth, just because I was a little bit out of step with the civil rights orthodoxy of the time. Yeah. On the religious front, it was really quite interesting. I mean, I'll just tell one anecdote quickly, which is that people like Robert Reich, myself, Tom Schelling, and other members of the faculty at the Kennedy School, we were offering a course on ethics, mandatory course for first-year students of our 2-year master's program in public policy. And one day I was sort of high in my early Christian enthusiasm. I came into a faculty meeting, a meeting of the faculty for this course. We were like 12 of us teaching, lectures to a plenary session and then breaking up into smaller groups. And I said, we're trying to get these kids to think about right and wrong, and yet we don't even talk about religion. And I said, not that we have to teach them a particular religion. Yeah. They came with religious sentiments and cultural inheritance of one kind or another. Isn't that a resource that we might draw on? It's one thing to know right from wrong. It's another thing to do the right thing when the time comes. Why don't we remind them of the possibility that such resources might be combined with a sort of academic, we would teach them about Kant or about Rawls or something, remind them of that. Yeah. And the reaction was really quite interesting. A minority of my fellow faculty members would say privately to me, "Oh, I'm so glad you said it. I'm so glad you said it." But the public line was, "You can't go there. That's really over the bounds. That crosses a line. That gets us into a kind of sectarian thing." And it was not thought to be an appropriate subject for discussion. So nothing actually happened with our curriculum from that intervention. And I think there was and there is now a reluctance to take seriously this dimension of human experience in the academy because it grates against the prevailing sensibility.
Yeah, I mean, I teach it, as you know, in political philosophy, and I'd say generally in the field, the level. I myself not a believer, nor I wasn't raised as one. I've never been one. I'm not I don't have a kind of village atheist sensibility, the kind of thing that Chris Hitchens is parading around with now. I don't feel any antipathy, generically speaking, to religious views or people who hold religious views. I think there are, hideous things that have been done in the name of religion and hideous things that have been done in the name of rooting out religion. So it's not it's never been a kind of personally compelling issue for me, but I think it's an incredibly important issue, and I think the level of ignorance about religious ideas, religiously founded morality, whether in the Judeo-Christian tradition or Islamic or Confucian, or Buddhist, the level of ignorance about it and people who do the kinds of stuff I do is really just staggering. And and I think the staggering ignorance is to the detriment of work that's done in the field. There's an interesting, if you take the exceptional person in our field, John Rawls. I don't know if you've heard about this, but everybody had known for a long time that Rawls had gone through, or people who knew him knew that he had gone through a very religious period early in his life when he was in college.
I never knew that.
And, recently, just about a year ago, a professor of religious studies at Princeton was kind of wandering around through the stacks, and there was a section of undergraduate theses, including Sam Alito's thesis on the Italian Constitutional Court, and there was John Rawls's undergraduate thesis, never mentioned by anybody, including Rawls, which was about faith, sin, and community. And the first premise, he says, this is the opening of the thing, the first premise is there exists a God who revealed himself in Christ Jesus. That's the first premise.
Almost said, my God.
Yes.
And that's something.
it's an incredible thing. It's going to be published by Harvard University Press, and I've been involved with it a lot because Tom Nagel and Tom teaches philosophy at NYU. We've written an introduction to the thing on themes in this undergraduate thesis, which is remarkable in the way that you would expect Rawls, even at 21, to have been a kind of remarkable ethical thinker. Yeah. Continuities between it and and his later work. But I think one of the things that he lost, this was when he was in an Orthodox Episcopalian period, and he lost that Orthodox Episcopalian faith as a result of a set of experiences during World War II, including the experience, not direct in this case, the experience of coming to terms with the Holocaust, at which he simply, though he didn't write anything about that except a few passages in the latest things that he did, which he said he simply couldn't reconcile with any kind of religious orthodoxy. But the thing that I think was important here was that concerns about religion and the importance of religious faith and the importance of conflicts founded on religious faith really were very formative for the work that he did as a political philosopher.
Yeah.
Even though the premises of his political philosophy weren't religious, part of his concern was to come to terms with the phenomena associated with fundamental moral and religious disagreement.
Yeah.
And arguably, and I think the case is stronger having read this thing, arguably it was his own deep appreciation of the strength and importance of religious conviction that helped to shape his own intellectual achievement in moral and political philosophy. So it just underscores for me though again, not myself a believer, my field. I don't think this is true about math. I don't think math would be better taught if there were more discussion about whether fundamental truths of arithmetic are made by God or not. And I don't think, intelligent design has anything at all to contribute to a biology course. But I think there are areas, and maybe moral and political normative thought in particular, where the ignorance of the content and strength of religious conviction really is a source of disadvantage in
I want to ask you a question. I'm going to pretend to be a student in this lecture, and the question in my mind is, how would you distinguish between the sociological fact of pluralism and pluralistic religious beliefs? So now we have people who are Muslim, who are Catholic, who are Jewish, who are atheist, all in the same society. It's a democratic order, and they need to get along, and so there's a philosophical problem raised just by that sociological reality.
That's right. Yes.
On the one hand, and argument from revelation, the reverence of sacred text, the evocation of supernatural or sort of faith-based reasoning in deliberation on the other. Do you see what I mean? In other words, religion may, as a sociological fact, trigger in us deep philosophical inquiry about important questions simply because of the reality that our societies consist of people who are differing in these fundamental convictions, which can't be resolved by argument.
I agree that they
but
can't.
But it doesn't follow from that the content of any one of their particular faith traditions tells us anything about anything, except that it is the inheritance of this particular culture, this particular religious development.
I think the fact of fundamental religious, philosophical, and moral pluralism, people living together in a society where there is that fundamental disagreement, and where, here I agree with you, there isn't any way crazy, I think, to believe that disagreements of that kind are going to be resolved through argument. So then you face a problem, which is how do you live together, but also how do you live together in a democratic society and in a democratic polity, where part of living together in a democratic polity isn't just keeping the peace, but trying to find some kind of common terms of public argument, what Rawls in his later work referred to as public reason.
Yeah.
Some kind of shared common ground of argument that people can appeal to and argue with one another on the basis of, given their deep disagreements and the unresolvability of those deep disagreements. And I do think that it's extremely important to find that kind of common basis of argument, of appeal to political values like equality and liberty and equality of opportunity and maybe some conception of community, ideas of fairness, ideas of democracy, and to try to keep our public argument focused on those political ideas that we can share as a common ground of argument. And then it's very important that each of us, or lots of us, rooted in different traditions, have our own reasons for accepting those public terms of argument.
Yeah.
So there, if public reason of the society, if that's Rome, it's really important that there are, not all roads lead to it, but that many different roads lead to it. But I think finding that kind of common basis of argument, shared basis, it's very fragile.
Yeah.
Finding that shared basis of argument in a pluralistic society is very important. And what I think that means is, on the one hand, you don't argue from revelation or from, for that matter, Aristotle's ethics. Doesn't matter whether it's secular or religious. You don't argue from your fundamental axioms in political life. You stick on the ground of common theorems, so to speak. You don't go to the fundamentals, whether they're religious.
I'm reminded of Stephen Carter's book that Bill Clinton, when he was president, made famous by holding it up at a press conference or something, The Culture of Disbelief, where the Yale law professor, the political liberal, but he was complaining about the fact that faith is marginalized in the society, and people have to. My sense is that at least at that time he would have responded to what you just said by saying, if I'm a believer and I come into the public square to make an argument, are you telling me I have to bracket my religious self in order to?
It's very interesting. If you go back and you look at the speeches that Martin Luther King Jr. made.
Yeah.
And, there is a kind of, there's a kind of what lawyers call arguing in the alternative that he goes in for. So when he's, making a case for civil rights laws or for, nonviolent resistance, or for opposing the Vietnam War, 1967, breaking silence, he always has an argument that has a religious foundation. He also always has an argument from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution interpreted, as with Lincoln, Constitution interpreted through the Declaration of Independence. There's an argument, there'll be a moral argument, there'll be a religious argument, there'll be an American national political tradition argument. He never just says, I hope I'm right about this, I've read most of the speeches.
We'll find out soon, I think.
We'll find out soon. He never just argues from religious premises.
Yeah.
And I think there is a kind of basic respect that he's showing for the other players in the argument who don't share his basic
I see. So he's not bracketing
premises.
his religious self, but he's saying, here's a reason for you to agree with me, even if you don't share my more fundamental commitments.
That's right. And it's very important, when you live together in a political society and the argument is about what the basic terms of the Constitution and the laws are going to be that we are all going to live by, it seems to me that it's a pretty basic moral idea that you try to find some kind of argument that other people can accept as well. I mean, assuming that they're, other reasonable people, that they're not, murderers and they're not amoral and they're not cruel and indecent, but they belong to another religious tradition or a secular moral tradition. And you try to find some kind of argument that appeals to their convictions as well. That doesn't mean that you can't say what your convictions are. Of course, that's a fine thing to do. But when it comes to justification of the laws and the Constitution that we all live by, that idea of operating on some kind of common ground is, I think, is pretty fundamental.
Okay, well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Do you think that common ground with our fellow Muslim citizens in this polity and our fellow Muslims who share the planet with us here can be found?
Well,
when the rhetoric, I just want to say this, Maureen Dowd has a column in this morning's New York Times. You may or may not have seen it. She's talking about Rudy Giuliani and the Islamo-Fascism Week. Giuliani just gave a speech in front of a largely Jewish audience, as it happens, but the point was that Giuliani was
This is the speech where he criticized Obama also.
He criticized Obama and Clinton and the Democrats who he hasn't heard one of them talk about Islamo-Fascism just yet, and this is Islamo-Fascism Awareness Week, and he knows that he's going to offend some people, but the ones that he's going to offend are the right people to be offended. They're the terrorists. Other law-abiding and decent Muslims are not going to be offended by him talking about Islamo-Fascism Week. Yeah. Well, I don't see how a person being a Muslim couldn't be offended. I mean, Christo-fascism in reference to people who are picketing outside of abortion clinics. Judeo-fascism in reference to people who are for the whole land of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. I mean,
if you take there's a long tradition of thinking that Nazism was Christo-fascism. This was Christian anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but there's a long tradition of thinking that by sincere and decent people of thinking that this is Christian anti-Semitism achieving its ultimate expression. Now, I think it would be awful if people stopped talking about Nazis and the Holocaust in Germany and started talking about the Holocaust committed by the Christo-fascists, even though you can argue the case that those were the roots of that, and I think it's absurd to think that Christians, whether Catholics or Protestants, whatever their form of Christianity, who think that the Holocaust was a hideous evil, would say, Christo-fascism, that doesn't mean me. They'd be offended by it. They'd be disgusted by it. And the idea that it's okay to talk about Islamo-fascism because there are people who make a defense from within Islam for the use of terror bombings, and so that makes it okay to talk about Islamo-fascism. I think that's ridiculous, and as ridiculous as thinking that it's okay to stop talking about Nazism and start talking about Christo-fascism.
Yeah. Well, when 50 Cent, the rapper, was being questioned aggressively about the use of bitches and hoes and all that kind of rhetoric, his answer on one occasion was, there really are bitches and hoes in the ghetto. I mean, and the fallacy of the reasoning is because one might be able to find an instance in which someone's behavior might be more or less accurately described with one of these pejorative terms, doesn't undo the damage that's done to a class of people by the routine use of the term.
It's just awful.
And the fact that there are Islamists who behave like fascists doesn't undo what seems to me to be the damage done by the easy, widespread public evocation of this construction.
So let me give an example of somebody who's been in, you mentioned Rivers before, somebody who's been comparably, brave on these issues. Khaled Abu al-Fadl, who's a very distinguished Islamic legal theorist who teaches at UCLA Law School, written lots of books. Brilliant guy, had the privilege of publishing a couple of his things in Boston Review that it resulted in books, one on Islam and the problem of toleration, and the other on Islam and democracy. And Khaled tries to show, using the point of both of these books, it's very much in the style that I was describing before, tries to show, using the resources of Islamic legal and political thought, what kind of case you can make for religious toleration on the one side, that was one of the arguments, and democracy on the other side. Powerful arguments. I'm, not being a Muslim, I'm not really prepared to say whether they are the best or, most reasonable interpretation of Islam. But the effort is there, and he has come under, as you could imagine, very serious political assault, and with threats to his life. For the work that he's done. I can't imagine. I know him a little bit. I don't know him well, and I shouldn't speak for him, but I'm going to just take a wild guess that he would find the invocation of Islamo-Fascism, horrible, disgusting, inappropriate, and also, very importantly, he'd say, I'm just guessing, he'd say, it makes his work that much harder.
Right.
Because then it looks like, when somebody says Islamo-Fascism, and he's making the argument about Islam and toleration and Islam and democracy, people who are attacking him say, see who you're siding with. It's a huge problem in the, a huge problem in the world.
But
the idea that
I just want to on this topic just raise another aspect. It occurs to me that one of the arguments that you'll get back, and according to Maureen Dowd in this morning's newspaper, Giuliani makes this argument in the speech, is that, well, you people are just, and David Brooks, I remember in a column about a year ago, made exactly the same argument. He says, you people, you academicians, you people at the university, you're politically correct. You're too concerned about giving offense to anybody. You want to sanitize that. The person on the street, ordinary Americans, those who watch those towers fall, they are not encumbered by the niceties of your language. And perhaps a politician like Mr. Giuliani fancies himself appealing to this kind of realism instinct, and this revulsion against the sort of political correctness of the supposedly left-wing academy and the Democratic Party elites and the coastal California, New York elites. Let's get down to Main Street. Let's get down to cases. Let's get down to the level that ordinary people are. And so rather than providing leadership, they are pandering in a certain kind of way and debasing the currency of our discourse. Or would you disagree with that?
Lincoln talked about appealing to the angels of our better nature. And when Lincoln was saying that, he understood that was only part of our nature, but that, but it's the part you try to appeal to because that's the part that we depend on to live together and, minimally in peace, but, on some kind of decent terms, maybe in, you hope at the end of the day in justice. And the idea that, as a politician, what you do is you appeal to the devils of our worst nature. It's just terrible. I don't think. I don't doubt that Giuliani can win some votes that way. And I think on these issues, I do think Giuliani is he's likely to be the Republican candidate, and I think he's a pretty dangerous guy. I actually think that he's less likely to do serious damage in Iraq. I think he probably has a better chance of doing something constructive in Iraq than anybody else. There's a longer story there, but we don't have time to go into it.
Yeah.
But I think, but on Iran, I think he's probably about as bad or arguably worse than anybody. And I think that kind of pandering, and pandering is fine when the stakes aren't so high.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about, a huge global problem, and you talk about Islamo-Fascism, and you invite people to say Christo-Fascism. So what are we going to do? We're going to turn into a globe of holy wars now. It's the worst. I know you got to teach, Glenn.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to terminate here.
Good.
Wish we could carry on, but
to be continued.
Indeed.
All right. Good to talk.
Okay. Take
Bye-bye.
care then. Bye.